To check out all our products, go to musicnomadcare.com. Hey, it's Rand with Music Nomad. This video is designed to show you how to set up your guitar using Music Nomad's Keep It Simple setup method. The KISS process uses our precision gauges and tools combined with step-by-step general guidelines anybody can follow and set up their guitar to play and sound great. To get the job done right, you will need our 6-piece precision gauge set that includes a truss rod gauge and pick capo, string action gauge, radius gauge set, nut height gauge, and a 24-page instructional booklet. All of these uniquely designed to make the process much easier and precise than other gauges out there. The 3 Music Nomad tool sets are a 26-piece Guitar Tech screwdriver and wrench set, 11-piece truss rod wrench set, and a diamond-coated nut file set. With these 4 kits, you are able to set up most all guitar and basses out there. Before you get started on your setup, there are some pre-setup steps you should do. Remove all your strings with the Music Nomad grip cutter. With the strings now off, and with the Music Nomad radius gauge, measure and make a note of the fretboard radius, as you will need this info when you measure the string radius in the setup process. Tighten all screws, including the tuning machine bushings, with Music Nomad's Guitar Tech tool set. Polish your frets with Music Nomad's Fine Fret Polish. Clean and condition the fretboard with Music Nomad's F1 oil. Clean the body and neck with Music Nomad cleaners. Finally, put new strings on with Music Nomad's grip winder. Okay, now you're ready to start the setup, featuring our talented guest guitar tech who will lead you through the process. Have fun.
Hi, Jeff Luttrell here. I own San Francisco Guitarworks and Sonoma County Guitarworks, and I am here to set up this beautiful Fender Precision bass using the Music Nomad Keep It Simple setup method. With the goal of making setups accessible to everyone, my collaboration with Music Nomad has created a simple setup process to help you make your guitar play and sound great. Let's get started. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the flow of the setup. I know that you've already been introduced to the pre-setup steps by Rand in the initial part of the video. So you've cleaned your instrument, you've put on new strings, you've measured your fretboard radius, and you're ready to get into the actual setup. So the process of the setup is pretty straightforward, and it's logical, and it's very easy to follow. What we'll do is we'll first measure the neck relief, which is the amount of curvature in the fretboard, and we will set our neck relief. Then we'll move down to the bridge, and we're going to set our outer string action heights, and then our inner 2 strings we'll set using a radius gauge. Then we'll move down to the nut, cut our nut slots to the correct height, and then set our intonation back at the bridge, and then lastly we'll set our pickup heights. So this is an individually adjustable saddle bridge, so we'll be able to adjust each string by itself. So we'll use those saddles to adjust not only the height of the strings above the fretboard, but also the radius of the strings to make for an even playing across the neck. So for the first step, we're going to need our pick capo to hold down our string at the first fret, and we'll need our truss rod gauge. And this is going to allow us to measure our neck relief. Before we get started on the setup, be sure that your instrument is in tune. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be generally in tune. That's going to ensure that the amount of tension on the neck is exactly what you're going to have when you're playing normally. And I'm looking good. So now that we're in tune, I'm going to go ahead and install my pick capo at the first fret. I'm going to go over the E string, under the A, and over the D. It's going to hold my low E string down at the first fret, so I don't have to hold it down with my hand. Then the bass goes into the playing position. The truss rod gauge is labeled so you can easily see which gauge you need to use for your instrument. We have 3 different feeler gauges on here, and this is actually a really cool little gauge. If you go down to the hardware store and buy a set of feeler gauges, you're going to get a bunch of gauges you're not going to use. They're going to be covered in oil, and they're kind of a mess. So this is a really clean and concise gauge. It's a lot simpler. We have notated on here electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and bass, and then classical guitar. So for bass guitar, we're going to use the 8/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge to measure our neck relief. You might be wondering why 8/1000ths, not 12 or 7 or 6. what we've learned over doing thousands of setups over the last 20 years and having a Plek machine for 8 or 9 years now, we have found that basses, when set up with 8/1000ths of an inch relief, tend to have the most even action up and down the neck and play generally the cleanest. If you're a really heavy hitter, you might need a little bit more relief. If you have a lighter touch, you might be able to go with a little less, but 8/1000 is a really good starting point. So in order to make that measurement, I'm going to fret at the 12th fret with my right hand. I've got my pick capo fretting at the 1st fret, so I've created a straight edge between the 12th fret and the 1st fret. So I'll take my 8/1000 feeler gauge and I'm going to put this between the 6th fret and the string. So I'm going to lay it on the 6th fret and just push it in between the string and the fret, and I've got a huge gap between the gauge and the string. So now what do I do? Well, if I look at my gauge, we have the touch rule here on the handle, and it shows if I have no touch, which is what I have, it's not touching the string at all, I'm going to turn my truss rod clockwise and tighten it. The way that you govern relief is by using the truss rod. The truss rod is a metal rod that goes through the neck. It has an anchor at one end and it has an adjuster nut at the other. If your neck has too much relief, like this one does, you tighten the truss rod and it straightens the neck out and removes relief from the neck. So I'm going to use I believe this is a 3/16 Allen wrench. So I'm going to go ahead and get into my truss rod wrench kit here and find the correct size wrench. Yep, and it is a 3/16 Allen wrench. So using my touch rule, I'm going to turn my truss rod clockwise, which is going to tighten the truss rod and remove relief from the neck. So let's go ahead and tighten this up a little bit. It's fairly snug, but it's not too bad. So once I've done that, I'll take my wrench out, back to the playing position, and I will measure again. Still got quite a bit of relief there. And if you are having a hard time seeing, you can hold down with your pinky and you can come up here and push the string up and down with your index finger, and you can see if you've got a gap or not. And I still do have a gap. So let's come back down here and put the wrench back in. Anytime you're adjusting the truss rod, you want to make sure that your wrench is well seated in the truss rod nut. Now this is a made in Mexico P-bass, so it has a truss rod adjust at the headstock. It is, like I said, a 3/16 Allen wrench. If you've got an American standard P-bass or a vintage bass, it's going to have the truss rod adjustment at the heel. When you have a heel adjust truss rod, you have to take the neck off the bass in order to adjust the truss rod. The best thing to do is loosen your strings, loosen your neck bolts, pull the neck up. And sometimes you can just tilt the neck back and access the truss rod nut, but sometimes you have to pull the neck all the way off. Tighten it. You're just going to have to guess how much or loosen it depending on what you need to do, and then put it back on, string it back to pitch, and remeasure. And then you've just got to go through that process until you get the truss rod where you want it. This one, luckily, I've got the headstock adjust. So I'm going to tighten that up some more and remeasure. That's looking a lot better. So now I think that we are just about there. Got just a tiny bit more to go. And it's good that I only have a little more to go because that truss rod is getting really tight. You have to know, by feel when to stop. Luckily, I hit my relief measurement that I want right as the truss rod was really getting to the point where I wouldn't want to adjust it any further. If you start to adjust your truss rod and it feels like it doesn't want to turn, just do not force it. You can do a couple of things. One, you can just leave it alone and take it to your tech if you feel like you're not comfortable doing it, or you can back the truss rod off, loosen it. Sometimes it'll pop, and then you can loosen it up and put a little bit of oil on the nut and then put it back in, and it'll start working a lot more easily. All right, so now we have our truss rod adjustment made so that our relief setting is set at 8/1000ths of an inch, measured at the 6th fret, fretted at the 1st fret and the 12th fret. So the next thing that we're going to move into is setting our bridge action height and radius. So I've measured this neck radius at a 7.25 inch, which is a standard vintage Fender radius. It's fairly round, and I'm going to set my bridge radius to a 7.25 to match the neck. First thing I'm going to do, though, is set my outer two strings action height. So if I get my string action gauge, I will notice on here, I'm going to use the inches side because I haven't gotten hip to metric, but I'm going to use inches. And if I look at bass, the most common measurement, action height measurement for a bass is 85 thousandths of an inch on the bass string and 75 on the treble string, so the E and the G. That's a really good kind of just medium-low, comfortable action for most players. If you do a lot of slapping or you have a really light attack, you could go down from there. Or if you're a really heavy-handed, James Jamerson kind of player, you can't have any fret buzz ever. You might want to go up a little bit from there, but it's a really good starting point. So what I'll do is I'll measure at the 12th fret. I'm going to use the side of the action gauge that says measure at the 12th fret, top of the fret to bottom of string in inches. So what I'll do is I'll fret at the first fret, and then I'm going to put my gauge behind the low E string. And what I'm looking for is at the 12th fret, what line matches up to the bottom of the string. And so what I'm finding here is I will put my gauge right at the 12th fret. I can see that the 0.05 is too low, the 0.06 is too low, 7's too low, 8's too low. I mean, this is sitting at about 110 thousandths of an inch. So that's the 0.11. That's 0.110, 110 thousandths of an inch. So this is quite a bit higher than what I'm going to want. So I will lower my string action at the bridge to bring that string down at the 12th fret. I'm going to go ahead and measure the G while I'm over here. And we're sitting at about 90 thousandths on the G, maybe 85, 90 right in there. If the string sits right on top of the line, it's the measurement notated above the line. If it covers the line, it's 5 thousandths of an inch less than that number. So the gauge is set up to be measured in 5 thousandths of an inch increments. All right, so let's get my proper Allen wrench to be able to adjust these saddles. These saddles adjust, very common, individually adjustable saddles. They have 2 saddle height adjustment screws going through the saddle. If you tighten the screws, it drives the screws down and lifts the saddle up, raising the action. If you loosen the screws, it backs them out of the saddle and allows the saddle to drop down, lowering the string action. So since I'm going to want to lower the string action, I'm going to back the screws out and drop the string down. So I believe that this is a 1.5 millimeter on these. Yep, sure enough. So this is a 1.5 millimeter Allen wrench. So I'm going to back this out a little bit. Whenever you're adjusting individually adjustable saddles, whether they're on a bass or on a Stratocaster, Telecaster, what have you, you want to make sure that your saddles stay parallel to the bridge base. You don't want them at angles. You want the pressure to be evenly pressing down on both saddle screws, which means I'm going to need to tune my string back up because it's now too low. And I will go back in to get my string action gauge. Okay, that brought me down to about 95. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down a little bit more. All right, and there we are at 85 thousandths. It's just right on the money there. And now I'm going to bring this treble string down, the G string down to 75. Tiny bit low. Let me bring that up just a bit. And there we are at 75. So now that I have my 2 outer strings set, I'm going to tune them back to pitch, and I'm just going to play them to make sure that they, all the notes ring clearly. Little buzzy up here in the upper register. This bass probably has some fret imperfections. You know, what do they say? There's no money above the 7th fret, so maybe this customer wouldn't care if it was a little buzzy up there. The notes aren't choked, but if they do play up here, that could be a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and raise this up just about a 5/1000 of an inch to compensate for that little bit of fret imperfection up there. It's a lot easier to be able to bring the action back down than it is to try to explain away fret buzz. So I'm going to just raise that up to 90. And that's one of the things you're going to learn as you start doing your own setups is the specs are, they're great, they're well thought out, they're tried and true over years and years, but if the frets aren't right, you may not be able to hit those numbers. So, or hit those numbers with everything playing perfectly cleanly. So let me just, so now I'm up to, just brought it up to 90. And that cleaned it up. I mean, it's only 5/1000 of an inch, and that really made it a lot cleaner. So now I'll play the G. It's nice and clean all the way up and down the neck. So that's going to work well. Now I will set my bridge radius. And I'm going to use my radius gauge here. These are really nice. Like all the other gauges that we designed, these have a black background with white lettering. They're really easy to see. And they have a couple of reminders on here that your string radius equals your fretboard radius. And you measure about 1/4 of an inch in front of the saddles. So I'm going to put the radius gauge down on the strings right in front of the saddles. And this radius is pretty close. The A is a little bit high. But it's surprisingly close. So I'm going to lower the A string. Now, using the radius gauges, you have to be careful that you actually know what you're looking at. So what I tend to do is I'll put the gauge on and I look down the strings so that I can see the contact point between the gauge and the string itself. So I should be able to visually detect, is there a gap? And I see a gap at the low E. That's because it's resting on that A string. So you can look at it. If you have trouble seeing it, you can gently push the gauge up and down and you can see what strings are moving and what strings are not. When I do that, I see that the A and the D are moving before the E and the G, so they're a little high in the middle. And lastly, you can very gently put the gauge on and you can pluck the strings and hear what's buzzing and what isn't. So I've got the A, the D are buzzing, the G is barely, the E is barely. So I'm going to bring down this D and A right here. So that is good. And then the same thing that you did on your E and G. So nice and clean, plays really well. So now I've got my truss rod adjusted for my proper amount of neck relief. I've got my action set on my outer 2 saddles. I have my bridge radius set using my radius gauge and Allen wrench to set my saddles. And so now I'm going to move up to the nut, and we're going to cut the nut slots correctly. Now the nut is a really important piece of equipment on the guitar. It governs many different things. It governs the action height at the 1st fret. You know, is it going to be hard to play? Is it going to be easy to play? It impacts intonation at the 1st fret. If the nut slots are too high, the first position notes can play sharp. It governs tuning stability. If the nut slots are too tight, the strings will bind and you will have erratic tuning. If the slots are too loose, the strings can buzz. So cutting the nut slots correctly is really important. With the nut height gauge and the new diamond coated files, it's really easy to get your nut slots cut correctly so that your bass or guitar plays really well and stays in tune. So what I'll do first is get my nut height gauge. And this is very similar to the truss rod gauge. This is a series of feeler gauges, only the ones you need. These go from 12/1000 of an inch up to 22 thousandths, so that's going to cover any guitar or bass that you would have as far as nut height goes. And the way that they're used is the same way as we used on the truss rod gauge. We're going to slide the gauge in between the string and the first fret, and it's either going to heavily contact the fret and the string, it's going to be perfectly smooth between the two, or there's going to be a space. And so we'll either cut the nut slot down if there's a space, we'll leave it alone if it just touches, and if it's a heavily touching, we'll listen for a buzz. If it buzzes open, then we'll need to fill the slot or get a new nut made. But if it doesn't buzz, we'll just keep going. So the first thing I'll do is put the bass into the playing position, and then I'll pick out my proper gauge for my low E string. And that is going to be the 20,000ths of an inch gauge, and it's notated on there, E and A string on a bass. So what I'll do is no fretting, you don't have to do anything on the strings. You just take your gauge and put it between the string and the first fret. And I'm seeing a little bit of a gap there. This looks like it's maybe about 22, 23. There's definitely some room there between the string and the fret. So I'm going to cut this slot down. But I'll show you a trick first. Where's my tape? Where's my blue tape? So on a Fender headstock, there's a nut shelf behind the nut, and it's easy if you don't, if you cut too steeply when you're cutting your nut slots, you can hit that shelf and cut grooves into it with the nut file, which it just looks bad. So what we like to do is you can take a piece of painter's tape and you can run it through behind the nut and put it on the shelf behind it. This isn't going to keep you from cutting into the nut shelf, but it will at least give you some warning. So just don't cut too steeply. If you see that you're touching that tape, you definitely need to cut at a different angle. So I've got my files together here for the bass. These are the Music Nomad diamond coated nut files. They're really great. I've used every kind of file that you can imagine for slotting nuts, from the two-sided cheapies to the most expensive ones you can buy, and these are by far the best to use. They cut extremely smoothly. They leave a very smooth slot in the bottom. They're perfectly round, just like the string, and they just work great. You can use them in the handle, or you can pop the blade out of the handle if you're working in a little tighter quarters, or say you've got a string tree or some bar behind the nut. You can easily pop the blade out and you have a lot more clearance. So I use them about half and half, with or without the handle. Anytime that you're picking a set of files to use for an instrument, you're going to want to be sure that you have files that either match the size of the string that you're using, or that are slightly oversized by 3 to 4,000ths of an inch at most. That will give you enough room that the string will glide smoothly through the nut slot, but not be so big that the string is sloppy in the slot. If you have a 5-string bass, you're going to need a set of 5 bass nut files, typically from 50 to 130. It's going to be a fairly typical bass string set for a 5-string. 45 to 105 or 50 to 105 is very common for a 4-string. So just be sure when you're buying your file set, you just make sure that you know the instrument that they're going to be used for, and that you buy the size that matches that instrument. So what I'm going to do is, this is a 105,000ths inch file, just like this string is a 105. And I'm going to take the string out of the slot. Then I will take the nut file, put it down in the nut slot, and I'm going to just file back and forth, removing material from the bottom of the nut slot. You cut down at an angle so that you're sure that the string leaves the nut right at the front edge. The nut to first fret distance is critical for tuning, for intonation at the first fret. And if you somehow chip the front edge of the nut, or you cut at an upward angle, you will change the distance between the nut and the first fret, and you will alter the intonation in the low registers. So you want to cut down at an angle, and it also makes the note play cleanly. If you have a nut slot that's flat or is cut backwards, it can cause a sitaring sound, and it sounds like a fret buzz, but it's really a buzz in the nut slot. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen this up, take it out, put this down in the slot. Just give it a little bit of a Now you see I didn't go too far, because I don't know, let's pretend I've never done this before. I don't know how much material I'm going to take off. I don't know, how fast it's going to cut or how slow. So I want to be sure to take it easy in the beginning so I have a feel. So I didn't take very much off of that. So I'm going to go ahead and go back in and do the same thing again. I'm not using a whole lot of pressure. I'm just going in and go back into playing position. Oh yeah, it's getting there. Yeah, that looks great. That's right on the money. So I'm going to move on to the A string. So I'm going to use the same 20 thousandths inch gauge for the A. So I'm going to slide it in under the E string and right over to the A. And I've got a little bit of room there. Couple thou. It's probably within the tolerance that would be considered acceptable, but I'm going to try to nail it right on the money. That's really the difference between an instrument that's really set up well and is just set up kind of okay. It's all those little decisions to just, I'm not going to quite go that far. That's good enough. That's what makes it okay. But if you really stick with it and nail all your measurements, you're going to have a guitar that plays exceptionally well. So I'll go ahead and pull this A string out of the way. Go ahead and get in there. And this is an 85 thousandths file. So now let's come in with a gauge. Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's no room there. So that's just that little bit of extra. All right, so now for my D string, I'm going to drop down to the 18 thousandths gauge. It's marked D, G guitar, D and G on bass. So we'll go ahead and move that in from the treble side, and I can see there is quite a bit of gap there between the string and the gauge. So I'm going to want to bring that down a little bit. So I'm going to use a 65 thou gauge on that. Or I'm sorry, 65 thousandths inch nut file on that. So pop that out of the string tree. And I noticed it was pinging as I was tuning, and this string is stuck in the slot. So this nut slot is too tight. So this cutting the slot to depth is going to accomplish two things. One, it's going to stop that pinging in the nut because we're going to open the slot up to the correct width, but it's also going to cut the depth correctly so that it plays a lot better at the first fret. There's some little ridge in there, so I'm going to have to come down the side here a little bit and cut that out. There we go. Okay. Now we'll check that again. That is good. That's right on the money. So now I've got the D string cut correctly, and I'm going to go ahead and measure the G. It's just a tiny, tiny bit high. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that string out and get my 45. And that is perfect. Actually, it's still a little proud. The angle of the gauge, really can impact how you see it. So you want to make sure you're right parallel on the fret. Okay, that's got it. So now we've measured our nut heights at the first fret and we've cut our nut slots to depth. So now we'll check for open string buzz to make sure that our nut slots are of adequate height. So you can just play your open string and make sure that you're not getting any buzz. These play super cleanly. You may have an instrument that's a little bit under spec, so you measure and the gauge heavily contacts the string and the fret. If that's the case, if you don't have any open string buzz, then you don't really have to worry about it. You know, the only problem that it would be causing is that the heights might feel a little uneven. But if it doesn't buzz open, then it really is high enough. If it's buzzing, though, you would need to, whether it came that way from the factory too low, or you bought a used guitar that's had the nut cut too low, or maybe you just went too far. At that point, you would need to either fill the nut slot or have a new nut made. You can also shim the nut up and then recut everything back down. Those might be better left to your local tech, depending on your skill level. Okay, so now we've set our truss rod to achieve the proper amount of neck relief. We have set our bridge action height and radius at the bridge. We shot for our target spec, but we had to raise it up just a little bit on the bass side because we have a little bit of fret imperfection up here, but it still came in really close. Set our bridge radius and cut the nut slots to the correct height. So now lastly, what we'll do on the playability adjustments is we will set our intonation. When an instrument is properly intonated, the fretted notes play in tune with the open string. So in order to achieve proper intonation, we have to adjust our saddles back and forth, and that is called compensation. So the reason that we do that is as you're pushing your string down to fret it, the string is being stretched and it's raising the pitch. So if we had no saddle compensation, all of our fretted notes would be sharp because as you're pressing the string down, it's increasing in tension, and by the time it hits the fret, now your note is too sharp. So in order to compensate for that, we lengthen the scale of the instrument to make those notes play flatter. The way that we're going to check our intonation is we're going to tune our open strings perfectly, and then we're going to fret at the 12th fret and at the 17th fret. We're going to play those two notes, and we're going to see if those notes are in tune. Now, if those fretted notes are too flat, we're going to move our saddle forward in order to shorten the scale and make those notes play sharper. If our fretted notes are too sharp, we're going to move the saddle back in order to lengthen the scale and make those notes play flatter. So the way that the adjustment is made is at the saddle, we have a saddle adjustment screw that comes in from the back. When you tighten the screw, it pulls the saddle back as the screw is tightened into the saddle. As you loosen the screw, there's a spring that pushes the saddle forward. So that's how you lengthen or shorten the scale, is by turning the screw to pull the saddle back or to let it move forward. Sometimes if you do need to move your saddles forward, as you're loosening the screw, the spring may not be powerful enough to push the saddle forward, so you might have to loosen the string or push the saddle a little bit with your fingers, or you can push it forward with the screwdriver, but you know, it should move fairly easily. So we'll put the bass in the playing position, and the first thing we'll do is make sure that our notes are right in tune. So this is the one area where you really want to make sure you're spot on. Okay, so now we're in tune, right on the money. That E is just, it's a little sharp. Okay, so spot on right there. So now I'm going to fret at the 12th fret. It's really good. It's a little bit sharp, and then at the 17th, that's a little bit sharp too. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my saddle back to lengthen the scale and flatten that note out. So I'm going to need a Phillips screwdriver for this particular instrument. Most typical is a Phillips. There's a couple of manufacturers that use Allen heads, but usually it's a Phillips. Okay, so I just moved that back a little bit. I'm going to get it back into tune. Okay, so that's right in tune. Now that's dead on the money. And that's perfect. Couldn't get any better than that. So now I'll move over to the A string. That's my open note. Make sure that's right in tune. Let's go up to the 12th fret. It's definitely a little flat. Definitely a little flat at the 17th. So I'm going to need to shorten the scale by moving the saddle forward. And on something like this is not just typically just a 1/8 of a turn. I mean, you actually have to move the saddle a little bit to get the intonation to change significantly. So I'm going to probably turn this, you know, two or three turns. And this is like what I was just saying, the saddle is not on its own moving forward, so I'm going to have to just push it a little bit with the screw just to overpower the tension of the string. So now back into tune. Okay, looks good. 12th fret, looks really good. 17th, it's a tiny bit sharp. Let's double check my open string. I'm going to move it back about a 1/2 turn. And to be honest, no one would ever hear that. That discrepancy was so minor. Anytime you're using a really high accuracy strobe tuner like this, a very, very slight movement is not going to be audible. But, you know, all things considered, you'd rather have it be perfect, right? Okay, looks good. Looks really good. And that's right on the money there. Okay, so now our D string open. Twelfth fret, looks great. 17th looks great. Tiny bit sharp, so I'll move it back just a little bit. I sometimes stretch the strings whenever I'm intonating. I have a habit of stretching the strings throughout the setup just to make sure that whenever the instrument's delivered to the client, it's ready to go on stage. So if you wonder, why does he keep stretching the strings? It's just really a habit of mine. If you stretch them once while you're doing your stringing, that should be enough, but I just tend to do it quite a bit. Looks good. Still a little bit sharp. I'm going to move that back just to hit a bit more. Looks good. And there we go. Just barely bouncing, but all right. Last but not least, there's our open string. 12th fret looks a little bit sharp. A little bit sharp on the 17th. So we're going to pull that saddle back to lengthen the scale. Looks good. Looks great. Okay, so now we've got our intonation set. You should be able to play all over the neck with really good tuning, you know, whether you're playing chords or octaves or, you know, whatever it is you do, you should be able to just nail it and be in perfect tune everywhere on the bass. So that covers all of the playability aspects with setting the truss rod, neck relief, bridge action and radius, cutting the nut slots correctly, and setting the intonation. So now last but not least, we're going to set our pickup height. Pickup height is an adjustment that, you know, you may end up final tweaking by ear, but we do have some specs that we recommend for a good starting point. Basically the end goal is to have a pickup or pickups that have even output from string to string, good balance and good punch. You know, if you have them really low, you may have even volume, but it just may not sound very good. If you have them too close to the string, they can impact the way the string oscillates, and you may end up with, it can sound overdriven and distorted. So even though it's even, it just doesn't sound right. In the setup guide on page 21, there's a spec for J and P bass, which is 3/30 seconds away from the strings. And what you'll notice is on this bass, you have the pickups are angled. And that's because in order to keep an even distance from the string to the pull pieces, they have to be angled in order to follow the arc of the strings. So we're going to go ahead and in the playing position, actually this doesn't matter because we're not making any neck adjustments. I'm going to get my string action gauge, and I have on the edge, on the corner, I've got a pickup measuring ruler. You can get into tight spots with it, so it makes things pretty easy. So I'm going to set these to 3/32 off the string, fretted at the last fret. So that is a little bit low, so I'm going to loosen this screw and bring that up a bit. Okay, so 3/32 there. We're looking good on the A. D is a little low. And the G looks good. One thing about pickups that are body mounted like this is they have foam underneath them, whether it's a Jazzmaster, a Jaguar, a J-bass, a P-bass. They have foam underneath, and if you have pickups that will not adjust up or down, you may have foam that has either just lost all of its ability to expand, or it has just become extremely hard. And if pulling out the pickups and finding foam and all that sounds like too much, more than you want to handle, just take it down to your shop. They've probably done it a million times, so they'll be able to help you out. Okay, so we're just going to listen to our string-to-string balance first. It's pretty even, but the D is a little bit hot. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the D side of this pickup down a little bit just by tightening the screw, which pushes it into the body. And it's just going to drop that part of the pickup away from the string. Turn it back up. It's pretty close. I'm going to drop it down just a bit more. Still sounds a little hot. Now that sounds much more even. So we've got a nice even response across all four strings, good punchy output, and the pickups, they look a little funky. So you can see that the pickups, they're not perfectly, they're not the same. The E and A is tilted a little more than the D and G, but that's what it took to get the output to be the same across all four strings. So, the setup specs definitely are going to get you in the ballpark, but just due to the differences in pickup outputs, the resonance of the instrument, the way your bass sounds, there's so many different factors. That final last little measurement, just, that's going to be your ear. So if your pickup, if it sounds too quiet in a certain area, raise it. If it sounds too loud in a certain area, lower it. So that's really all there is to it. This bass setup is like most bass setups that you would ever come across. J-bass, P-bass, Tele bass, any of the sort of, Fender derivatives, whether it's a parts bass or a Sadowski, or, they're all pretty similar. The only things that you can run into is, like we touched on earlier, a heel adjust truss rod. Accessing that can be a little trickier than the headstock. But other than that, typical, the bridges are all typical, and the pickup heights and the adjustments are all very similar. So in collaborating with Music Nomad to make the gauges and tools that you've seen me use during the setup process, I feel like the process has really become accessible for you, the player. The gauges are really well thought out to have only the measuring tools and information that you need for instrument-specific use. Both the measuring gauges, whether it's the radius gauge, the action gauge, or the truss rod or nut gauge, they have the information you need, they're easy to read, easy to use. Then you combine that with the tool set, whether it's the screwdriver set, the nut files, the truss rod wrench set, and you have a set of tools and gauges that will really enable you to set your guitar up the way that you want to. So using the KISS method with the gauges and tools, it will allow you to do a setup on your guitar to make it play and sound the best.
For detailed videos on how to use each gauge during the setup process, please visit musicnomadcare.com for all our how-to videos.